Hi everyone, this is Mr. Moreau, and I'm going to be taking you through the ELL Earth History PowerPoint. Now you have a notes document on Schoology that I hope you have downloaded and sent to Notability, and I want you to follow along with me, filling in the blanks and listening to the extra information I say along the way. Remember, in YouTube, you can also slow down the video if I'm talking too fast. You can also add closed captions, so the text will show up at the bottom of what I'm saying. Those are both great options for you. But here we go. Feel free to pause at any time. And we're going to go through and learn a lot about Earth's early history. And we're going to begin with how the planet first formed. So picture there being no Earth, no solar system in space. And about 4.6 billion years ago, material in outer space stuck together. All right, so material stuck together. What material is this? Dust, rocks, molecules of all kinds floating around in space, and those would stick together because it turns out that all molecules are attracted to other molecules depending on their size. And there are exceptions to this. Certain molecules, because of their electric charge, are attracted to each other or they repel each other. But this is not that. What we're saying here is that anything that has mass is attracted to anything else that has mass. Eventually, more and more material will stick together, and that's going to cause collisions as they collide into each other, as they run in to each other. It's going to cause compression, which is the entire planet squeezing together because of that force that holds these molecules that have mass together. And what is that force called that, for example, keeps us on Earth? That is called gravity. So gravity is the force that attracts these massive molecules together, and they get squeezed into the center of the Earth. So that's why we are attracted, or we stay on planet Earth, because of gravity. And that causes compression, so everything is squeezing together. Not only that, but we've already talked about something called half-life, where molecules that are radioactive will change or decay into other molecules. All three of those things, collisions and compression and radioactive decay, will cause heat. So much heat that all of this material that sticks together, it got so hot that it would melt. So you can see a picture there on the right of, it looks like a planet, but it looks like a planet on fire. And that is because it is all melted. Imagine how hot it must have been to melt rock. How hot would it be to melt rock? That's how hot the Earth was back then. If we go forward here, imagine what the atmosphere, what the air around that planet must have been like. It would have been very different from what it was today. Would have been much hotter. Lots of volcanoes would have been erupting. There would be no oxygen at that point. And if we were to go back, let's say we are on the Magic School Bus, and we go back to Earth 4 billion years ago, that would be toxic to us. We could not breathe it. It's a lot different back then than it is now. Okay, so there's a lot of major differences there. So before we even talk about how life began, we need to talk about how the planet became very different than a melted ball of lava. How could it eventually support life? Well, about 3.8 billion years ago, the Earth cooled, and that would finally allow water to be in liquid form. You know that when water gets too hot, it will boil and become a gas. Well, think of the opposite of that. If you have hot gas, that's water vapor, water gas, if it cools down, it will turn back into a liquid. If you keep going and it gets even colder, it would freeze and turn into a solid. So that's what happened. The Earth cooled, and the water that was a vapor turned into a liquid. So basically it rained. It rained on Earth for a very, very long time. So long that an ocean covered the entire planet. The entire surface of Earth was covered in water because so much water turned from gas to liquid to cover the Earth. So now we have a planet that's cool enough to support water. And how do we actually have organic molecules appear? Remember, organic molecules are molecules that make up living things. We're still not even talking about how life began on Earth. Okay, we're talking about how is it possible for these molecules to be on Earth at all. Well, this experiment sets to answer that question. Okay, the first organic molecules on Earth, where did they come from? How did they get here? Well, these two scientists, Dr. Miller and Dr. Urey, were American chemists, and they conducted an experiment. And this is what their experiment looks like. They were trying to prove whether it was possible for organic molecules to appear on Earth because of chemical reactions. So this is what they did. Right in this part here, they've got some boiling water. So they would put some heat under this water and cause that to start boiling. The water would go as a vapor, as a gas, up this tube and enter this area here. Now, in this area, they put gases, and those gases were the ones that they thought were present when the Earth was very young, when it was still a new planet. So they did some research and figured out what chemicals, what gases to put there. They also have this electrical charge going in there. They have wires for electrical current, and that would cause a spark, like an electric spark. And that is meant to simulate lightning, like thunder and lightning, which would be a very common occurrence back when the Earth was very new. So we have some chemicals mixed together along with the electricity plus water vapor. The water vapor would pass through these gases. Chemical reactions would occur because of the electrical charge, and it moves through this thing called a condenser. That just makes the water vapor cold again, so it becomes a liquid. And the liquid pools to the bottom of this little loop in the glass tube, and all the solid stuff that was stuck into the water vapor gets stuck on the bottom of this little U loop. Okay, so that little U loop in the glass, we have all this dirty solid stuff appearing. Where did that come from? Well, it must have come about because of the chemical reactions that were happening in this area here. So chemical reactions occurred, and it produced this stuff down at the bottom of the tube there. And what was in that stuff? Amino acids. Amino acids, you remember, are used to make protein, and protein is necessary for, that's right, living things. So this experiment showed that it is actually possible to make organic molecules even if you do not start with organic molecules. So this shows that in the early Earth atmosphere, chemical reactions could have happened that made the first ever organic molecules, making life possible. Now let's talk about life's origins. This is a very interesting topic because scientists look at lots of data and lots of experiments to think one thing, and they try to do their best to explain where life could have come from. A lot of people disagree with the data that scientists put forward. A lot of people rely on anecdotal evidence, stories told down from family to family. Some people turn to their faith to answer these questions. So there's a lot of different ways that people rely on how are they going to answer that question. It is a very difficult question to answer. Let me take you through the scientific hypotheses here. So the first cell, I think on the first week of school this year, we learned that all living things are made of cells. Well, if we know that all humans have a common ancestor, that means that all animals have a common ancestor. That means that all living things have a common ancestor. What was that first living thing that is the common ancestor for everything? That would be the first cell. So we talked about how these organic molecules can form, and they form these little bubbles. Okay, there are certain kinds of organic molecules, very similar to what you see in the cell membrane. Organic molecules like that form these little microspheres. Micro means very, very small, like microscope, and sphere is like a three-dimensional circle, right? You know that shape. So a microsphere, a little bubble made of things very similar to the cell membrane. Let's scooch ahead. So here's putting all these ideas together. The experiment by those scientists, Miller and Urey, it shows that molecules needed for life, organic molecules, can be made even if you start with no organic molecules. Here's our theory. Could these molecules, those maybe genetic molecules, the organic molecules that Miller and Urey showed are possible, could they have found a home inside a microsphere? Well, if we say yes, then we have organic molecules like genetic material, like RNA, DNA. We have organic molecules inside a microsphere. And you know what that sounds a lot like? Genetic material inside of a cell membrane? That sounds like the first cells ever. And it would be something like a simple prokaryote, a prokaryotic cell, like a small, simple bacteria. So this is what scientists think may be the best way of explaining where the first cells came from. Now, if we just left it there, I don't think we can imagine how life would have changed so much over time. So how did life go from small, simple cells to living things like a human that's made of trillions of cells put together? And those cells are much larger and more complex than those small prokaryotic cells. Well, one major thing that would have caused a difference in life would be the presence or appearance of oxygen. Where did that oxygen come from? Well, scientists have looked at fossils from way back that are billions of years old, and they discover that there are photosynthetic bacteria. Remember, photosynthesis is the same process that plants use to turn sunlight into food and energy. So a product of photosynthesis we know is oxygen. So there are bacteria that can actually do photosynthesis. As a result, they make oxygen. And the more that these bacteria do photosynthesis, the more oxygen they put into the atmosphere. So that's how oxygen became present in the atmosphere of the early Earth. As we add more and more oxygen to the atmosphere, here's an interesting point. That sounds like a good thing to us, right? More oxygen is good for life. Well, there was already things that were alive on planet Earth before oxygen. So some living things cannot survive in the new environment with oxygen present, and some things can. That means that life on Earth is going to change, because anything that's on Earth that cannot survive or breathe with oxygen will die. Any of those things that can tolerate the presence of oxygen, they will survive, reproduce, and make more things like them, so the populations on Earth become more like things that can use oxygen. So that really makes a huge change in what life is present on Earth. All right, let's move ahead into how we get into more complex living things. So how do we go from simple prokaryotic cells into complex eukaryotic cells? Now, here is a picture we have showing how some prokaryotic cells formed another membrane inside that cell that became the nucleus. Now, I think in your student picture, I have 2 arrows, and you might think you have to draw 3 pictures. You do not. I like this picture better, and I can't remember if it's going to fit on yours. So here's the picture that I have for you. In this one, we can see that the membrane is actually folding in on itself. So notice that it's not one continuous membrane on the outside, but rather the membrane seems to do this. I'm not even going to pick up my stylus here. It's like folding in on itself, and it can continue all the way around. You see how I never had to break this line? It goes all the way around and is still continuous. So there's a little bit of folding going on the inside, and that eventually becomes something like this, where we've got a full membrane bubble on the inside, and then some more membrane kind of layers on the outside. That looks a lot like the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell and the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER, of a eukaryotic cell. So this explains how a prokaryotic cell could become the first eukaryotic cell, folding of the plasma membrane on the outside of the cell. And if you have a cell with a nucleus, you know that that is called a eukaryotic cell. Well, what about all the other parts of a eukaryotic cell? Mitochondria, chloroplast, vacuole, all these other organelles that are inside. Well, ancestral prokaryotes, ancestral, that just means very old, like ancient, like our ancestors. They would have folding of their membrane to develop the nucleus. And look at what's happening in these pictures. This one here, cyanobacterium, that's a fancy word for a bacteria that can do photosynthesis. Aerobic bacterium, that is a fancy term for a bacteria that can use oxygen to make energy. I bet those look and sound familiar to you. A small green thing that's inside of a eukaryotic cell that can use the sunlight to make food and energy, I bet that sounds like the chloroplast. And then how about the other one, aerobic bacterium? A small orange thing in this picture that can use oxygen to make energy. I bet that sounds like our cells' mitochondria. That's right. Okay, now over to the last cell, you can see that there's many of them inside the cell. So if other bacteria cells that can do certain things all come together as one big one, that would be like the first complex eukaryotic cell. So it shows us how many small, separate prokaryotic cells could have come together to form one big eukaryotic cell. This is called the endosymbiotic theory. Endo means in, like these small ones are going inside the bigger one. Symbiotic means they're working together. And theory is our idea of how the first eukaryotic cell began. How about as we go from a simple single eukaryotic cell on the right side there to something larger, evolution of multicellular life. So let's talk about the time period in this range. 650 million years ago until 544 million years ago. During this time, we have very simple life forms, like what you see in the top of this slide. Okay, single cells, or maybe a few things that are multiple cells sticking together, forming multicellular organisms. They would be very simple life forms, and they can survive without oxygen. But as we said before, photosynthetic bacteria are adding oxygen to the environment. That's going to allow, like we said in the endosymbiotic theory, eukaryotic cells to appear. But still at this time, remember we said before that the entire planet was covered in water? Life will only exist in the water. So that is where life began on Earth. And scientists have made this prediction, this theory, because that is where they find the oldest fossils. They can tell by looking at a fossil where it came from. What kind of an environment did it live in? So that is how they were able to conclude that every single fossil they find that is this old always suggests that the living thing was in a water environment. Well, if we fast forward and go more recently, now we're going to talk about the time period from 544 million years ago all the way up to 245 million years ago. At this time, life has been in the water for a long time, so it becomes more diverse. We're going to start to see more living things in the water and more differences between those living things in the water. We will find, for example, a very important evolutionary development, the first organisms with a backbone. Vertebrates are animals with a backbone. So that's going to really allow for the body structure of these animals to become different over time. If you have a backbone, that's going to protect your spinal cord more. That's called a notochord, all those nerve cells that lead to your brain. So if that part is more protected, it can cause better development of a larger and more useful brain. So this is a major thing in evolution that shows us how complex life and how intelligent life became more possible and more common. This is when we would have found that the first living things walked on land. So during the Paleozoic era, somewhere from 544 to 245 million years ago, we would have seen the first living things walk on land. So what does that look like? You would have to imagine something that looks like a fish with legs walking onto land. Some people imagine this as a fish with fins crawling on land. However, scientists have looked at fossils and found fossils of things that look just like fish, but they have legs. That teaches us that legs developed underwater, and that allowed fish to walk, or some fish that had legs, to walk on land. So that is a very interesting theory and prediction of what the first animal was to walk on land. And then at this time, we also see that plants and insects appeared on land. Well, first of all, how did that land appear? That's a very interesting question. If you imagine, I'm just going to go down to the side here, imagine the water surface up here, and underwater you've got some volcanoes. Okay, so there's a lot of heat and pressure underneath the like the sand and everything at the bottom of the ocean. Well, eventually that is going to erupt, and lava is going to spew out and create a new layer of rock on the bottom of the ocean. And then every time it happens again, you get more and more and a higher layer of land until eventually it is above the surface of the water. So that would be, for example, how you see the first island appear. Okay, so that's how land appeared, and then we can see that much later, when life started to develop more so, we see the first living things actually walking on land. Okay, let's keep going forward. Now we've got the Mesozoic era, which is 245 million years ago, all the way until only 65 million years ago. Now at this time, this is when dinosaurs existed on land. Small mammals also would have been present on Earth. They look something like this. And we would have seen leafy trees, bushes, flowering plants, all of these develop, and that makes sense that it's the same time as the dinosaurs. How else could something so big as the dinosaurs survive unless they had ample food, lots of food? And those leafy trees and bushes and flowering plants, those would have been the major food source for all of those really large plant-eating dinosaurs. Now, one point here, I think a lot of people have learned that humans and dinosaurs were not alive at the same time. But a lot of people might get confused and also be surprised that dinosaurs and mammals actually did live on Earth at the same time. So the mammals would have not looked exactly like they do today. For example, don't picture lions and tigers and dinosaurs living together. No, the mammals would have been a lot different. See that picture in the top right of the screen? That's what some of those early mammals would have looked like. They would have been a lot more similar to reptiles. Okay, so mammals actually diverged from or evolved from reptiles. One group of reptiles that was just a little bit different than the others developed over many years to become something new, and we now know that group as the mammals. All right, if we go forward still, now we're at the Cenozoic era, and that is 65 million years ago until today. So this is when plants and animals and insects are doing very well on Earth. Mammals have a really good ability to adapt to the environment, and we can adapt to the environment well, and we can dominate life on Earth. So because mammals are warm-blooded, because they are good parents, because they have hair on the outside of their body, they can adapt to different temperatures, different food sources. They can ensure the survival of their offspring because they're good parents. For example, a bug is not a very good parent compared to a larger mammal. Okay, so like something like an elephant. Elephants put a lot of care into raising and protecting their babies. Bugs, on the other hand, do not. We also see in this time period appearance of human ancestors. We think that, we know that humans have evolved alongside apes and monkeys, and we have a common ancestor with them. A common misconception, people often misunderstand the fact that humans did not evolve from monkeys. Humans did not evolve from apes. That would mean that apes or monkeys turned into humans, and there would be no apes or monkeys anymore. They'd all be humans. No. What happened is we split apart from them, so we do share a common ancestor. Okay? We do share a common ancestor. And by that, I mean think of my family with like my brother, my sister, and our parents. My parents have siblings, and those are my aunts and uncles, and my aunts and uncles have cousins. So my cousins and me, we do not share the same parents, but we do share the same grandparents. That is our common ancestor. Well, if we go far back enough, I'm talking about not 1 million, not 2 million, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 million years ago, humans have a common ancestor with apes and monkeys. So that is how human ancestors appeared. We diverged or split from a common ancestor with apes and monkeys. Another major interesting thing that happened during this time period was the Ice Age. The environment got very, very cold, and that caused many living things to die, but it caused other living things to thrive or succeed under new circumstances. And that's something that really makes a drastic change with which living things are present on Earth. When something extreme happens in the environment, you usually see the types of living things present on Earth change a lot. So these are extra slides, not on your note sheet, but some great questions to ask during all this is, if these happened millions or billions of years ago, how do scientists know? Well, one major way we know is because we can look at fossils. Fossils are the remains or the traces of things that were alive long ago. So an animal dies and eventually we find its skeleton. That would be the remains of a living thing. Or maybe a bug gets stuck in tree sap, and then that sap turns very hard, and a scientist finds it millions of years later. Or maybe an animal has left a footprint on the ground, and the footprint hardens, and a scientist finds it millions of years later. Those are fossils, and they teach us about what living things used to be like. So in this picture, we see something has died, probably gets covered, maybe it falls into water, or maybe it gets covered in some new layers of mud and dirt. Over time, more and more layers of mud and dirt cover that living thing. And eventually, those bones turn very hard as water mixes with the bones and turns them to minerals, like rocks basically. And eventually the earth might change. Maybe an earthquake happens, or maybe a mudslide happens and all of this falls away. And that exposes part of the fossil. And then a scientist can come by and say, hey, I see some bones sticking out there. And they can dig this out and find out what this animal used to look like. And then another way we can know how old these fossils are, which we talked about earlier, is, I left this in there. This should be half-life. Okay, so the concept of half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of the material to decay into the new substance, and that allows us to determine the age of these fossils. So that's what allows scientists to know that a fossil is 1 million years old, 1 billion years old, 3 billion years old. And that is the intro to how our planet formed and how life formed and how that life changed on our planet. Thank you for listening, and go ahead and stay tuned for what we have next for us learning about not just that the life on Earth changed over time, but also how it changed over time.